Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. This is part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Asoka Bandarage. We really can't make this content without you, so if you're in a position to donate, feel free to go to our website, theAnalysis.news, hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen, and make sure you get onto our mailing list. That way you're always notified every time there's a new episode. You can like and subscribe to the show on podcast streaming services such as Apple and Spotify, or on YouTube. See you in a bit with Dr. Asoka Bandarage. Joining me now is Dr. Asoka Bandarage. She is an adjunct professor at the California Institute for Integral Studies. She has taught at Brandeis University as well as Mount Holyoke, where she received tenure. She is the author of a great book called Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, Colonial and Neoliberal Origins, Ecological and Collective Alternatives. And I actually had Dr. Bandarage on the show in August, so feel free to go back to that interview and listen to it as we go into more depth in the different themes that she discusses in her book. So thanks for joining me today, Dr. Bandarage.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be back on your show. Thank you.
Well, what do you make of the ports in Sri Lanka? I know there was a lot of controversy around some of the billionaires who own one or two of the ports. I know the Adani group, led by billionaire or run by billionaire Gautam Adani, has been under investigation recently for potential bribery. How much is he really influencing perhaps the direction of the country in terms of neoliberal policies and also controlling the ports?
Well, very much so, because India helped Sri Lanka during the crisis in terms of loans and provision of essentials, which was very gratefully acknowledged by the Sri Lankan government and the people. But India has also leveraged that to its advantage, politically, economically, and even culturally, and extending its control over the country using that leverage. And many of the new sort of privatized industries are being handed over to India, and India is having more and more control over the ports, the airports, the power grid, energy production, etc. For example, in Mannar, on the western coast, it's an island off the coast of Sri Lanka. Adani has gotten the right to develop a wind power project. Now, this was done without even environmental assessments being done. And it's a very sensitive ecosystem. And environmentalists are up in alarm about the implications of electricity generation there on the wildlife. It is a bird's paradise. A lot of migrating birds pass through there. And so that there's environmental issues and also the survival and livelihoods of local people like fishermen. So that's on one side. And then also the control of airports on the part of the Adani group raises a lot of issues about Sri Lanka's political sovereignty as well.
Well, when we talk about sovereignty, I think a lot of countries are also using Sri Lanka as kind of dumping grounds for its own toxic waste. And just to bring something up recently, which you pointed out to me, was that the Dali cargo ship, which is owned by a Singaporean company, but chartered by a Danish company, Maersk, this cargo ship hit the main pillar of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, resulting in its collapse. And this particular ship was actually carrying 56 containers containing waste, hazardous waste, potentially explosives, class 9 hazardous material. So Class 9 is a classification that the U.S. uses when it classifies hazardous material. And so it does beg the question, I mean, what are these ships doing? Essentially, they're transporting waste in a very transparent, perhaps illegal way. I mean, I remember seeing that there were some ships that were turned back even in 2017 and 2019 because they found like body parts and other biohazardous material from the UK. So how big of an issue is this in terms of other countries literally shipping their waste off to Sri Lanka?
Yeah, I think that this is a global issue. It is part of the exploitation of the global south by the global north, which is part of the neo-colonial paradigm. And this has been going on for decades of this export of hazardous waste to the so-called third world. It's a business. And there may be local companies and politicians and others, benefiting from that, but certainly not the local people or the environment for that matter. And again, with the Dali ship, this came to light only because of that accident. We don't even know how many containers were carrying hazardous materials and what these hazardous materials are. And oftentimes, there's violation of maritime, shipping guidelines. And this has created controversy in Sri Lanka with, different politicians and claiming that Sri Lanka is a transshipment hub. Many of these containers were going to be shipped elsewhere, but no one really knows the truth. But I think that this brings to light this continued exploitation of ex-colonies and the nature of neocolonialism, and that this is not just an economic issue, but it's a health issue, it's an environmental issue, and obviously an ethical issue.
Well, what do you make of President Wickramasinghe's climate commitments? Because I know at the recent COP28 last year, at the end of last year, he put forward, or slightly before then, he put forward a plan saying that in order to reach net zero by 2040, Sri Lanka would need $100 billion US. And this would require, cancellation of debt for nature swaps. Given the way the country is going right now and the policies that are currently in place, how do you think Sri Lanka will meet those targets? And what else do you think is necessary for it to actually improve the climate crisis that it's undergoing? Because, Sri Lanka is in a very vulnerable position in terms of its geographical location. It has huge, long beaches, and it's unfortunately ravaged by flooding and other sorts of natural, I don't want to call them natural disasters. These climate disasters are created by capitalism, essentially, and by the extractivism and destruction of nature that we're enacting on the environment. So how do you assess his climate goals and whether Sri Lanka will reach those goals?
Yeah, I think that we have to remember that the greenhouse gas emissions by a country like Sri Lanka is really minuscule compared to the emissions of countries like China, United States, or even India. I think Sri Lanka is like 0.05% of the total. So, which is not to say that it's not important, but in the large scheme of things, the countries that are the biggest emitters have a greater responsibility to take the policy actions needed more urgently. So to put the onus of climate mitigation on poorer countries and poorer populations, raises some fundamental questions. Because if you use debt for nature swaps or carbon credits and so on, and expect the poorer countries to protect their resources, the forests, for example, in exchange for debt cancellation, you are switching the onus of environmental protection, climate protection onto those countries which are not the biggest emitters, and particularly people who are dependent on forest resources, so on and so forth. So I think that there are environmental groups, who are questioning this as, again, a strategy that puts the burden on the global south, rather than, the taking the principle of the polluter pays, the polluting companies and the polluting countries bearing the greater responsibility. And in terms of Sri Lanka, I think, as you mentioned, the urgent issues is, coastal erosion, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and floods, droughts, and so on, which have become routine, but which are not being really addressed in the middle of this economic crisis, where average people are concerned about their survival, that in terms of getting their daily meals, because a lot of people have to cut back on not only having 3 meals a day, but having, they can hardly have 1 meal a day. And schooling, with the IMF cutbacks in social services, IMF policy-inspired cutbacks in healthcare and education, the famed healthcare and educational systems in Sri Lanka are being undermined. So in the middle of all that, there is not that much attention being paid to the environmental issues. But I think the environmental issues has to be seen in the broader context, not just in terms of climate mitigation alone.
That's a really good point, that it's not Sri Lanka that is one of the largest emitters when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. And I would argue that probably the large share of its emissions are actually as a result of certain multinational corporations, which are there employing people at, minuscule wages, not even a living wage, to make products that are then exported to Western countries or to the global north. So a lot of the environmental damage that's wrought by these multinational corporations are in some way tied to the global north, whether it's exporting these goods or whether these, it's companies from abroad that are investing in these multinational corporations. So that's perhaps another angle.
Absolutely. Going back to the plantation economy, the monocultural plantation economy, first coffee and then tea in the highlands, led to massive deforestation. And that led to landslides, which have contributed, to the flooding and a lot of the environmental hazards that are experienced today. So, yeah, it does go back to sort of the nature of economic policies, which not only was destructive of the environment, but also they undermined local food sovereignty, because export production of tea, rubber, coconut, etc. was promoted over local agriculture. And that's why the economic crisis was a product of that, the dependence on imports for survival, which was the colonial model that was set in place, or the export of raw materials, and then the import of essentials. And the kind of dependent economic model that was set in place has continued. And it's still been pushed by IMF, World Bank, and the global institutions, because it's still pushing countries like Sri Lanka towards export production rather than local agricultural production and economic self-sufficiency. I mean, that's the model of globalization.
Right, and there's probably more of that to come, because after this IMF bailout is finalized, after all the tranches are given to Sri Lanka, I believe there's a plan for the World Bank to also give $7 billion worth of loans for other sort of agricultural restructuring or projects, which would involve, I suspect it would involve these sorts of of agricultural policies and a focus on export rather than sustaining what Sri Lanka can produce on a local level.
Yeah, and there's another whole controversial program to develop agribusinesses and through transnational corporations by taking away some of the land from local producers. And over 80% of the land is still held by the state. And there is a lot of pressure on the government to commoditize these lands, because these are held on lease by these small holders. But if they are given freehold rights, then what's going to happen is these people are going to sell this land, and then it would fall into private hands, including external interests, to develop export production. And so local agricultural production, which will be further weakened, and the country would become even more dependent on imported food. So the food sovereignty is really a critical issue for people's survival, not only in Sri Lanka, but around the world and other countries, which are experiencing these debt crises.
Well, Dr. Asoka Bandarage, it's been great speaking to you again. I think everyone should revisit your work. You've written several books, the most recent of which is Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, which is really great. It really gets into these issues of neoliberalism and various crises and how they're all intertwined, and how Sri Lanka is really emblematic of these issues of globalization and economic inequalities, and unfortunately is bearing the brunt of a lot of really unsustainable policies. So thank you very much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you'd like to support us, feel free to go to our website, theAnalysis.news, and get onto our mailing list. See you next time.